Everyone knows Babe Ruth could hit home runs, but could he save a life? In 1926, when a dying boy's only wish was to meet his hero, Ruth proved that some victories happen far away from any stadium. It was October 1926, and America was in the middle of what newspapers called baseball fever. The New York Yankees were facing the St. Louis Cardinals in the World Series, and the entire country was captivating by the drama unfolding on the field. But in a small hospital room in Essex Fells, New Jersey, an 11-year-old boy named Johnny Sylvester was fighting a battle that had nothing to do with baseball and everything to do with staying alive. Johnny had been kicked by a horse while playing near his family's farm. The injury seemed minor at first, but complications set in quickly. What started as a simple accident had developed into a life-threatening case of blood poisoning. The infection was spreading through his small body, and doctors were running out of options. This was 1926, remember? Modern antibiotics didn't exist. When a child developed severe blood poisoning, families often received the news that parents never want to hear. There's nothing more we can do. Johnny's father, Horace Sylvester, was a successful businessman who could afford the best medical care available. But money couldn't buy what Johnny needed most, a miracle. The boy had been drifting in and out of consciousness for days. When he was awake, he was weak and barely able to speak. His fever spiked dangerously high, and doctors told the family to prepare for the worst. But Johnny had one thing that kept him fighting, his love for baseball, and specifically his devotion to Babe Ruth. Like millions of American boys in 1926, Johnny idolized the Bambino. His bedroom was covered with newspaper clippings of Ruth's exploits. He had memorized every statistic from Ruth's record-breaking 1921 season. When he was healthy, Johnny would spend hours in his backyard, swinging a bat and pretending to be his hero. Now, as he lay dying in that hospital bed, baseball seemed like the only thing that could still reach him. Johnny's uncle, who worked for a radio station, had an idea. He knew someone who might be able to get a message to Babe Ruth. It was a long shot, but what did they have to lose? The message was simple. An 11-year-old boy was dying, and his greatest wish was to hear from his hero. What happened next revealed something about Babe Ruth that the public rarely saw: his genuine love for children, and his understanding of what his fame could mean to those who needed hope most desperately. Ruth didn't just send a telegram or an autographed photo. He didn't delegate this to his manager or publicist. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone, including his own teammates. In the middle of preparing for the most important games of his career, Babe Ruth drove to Essex Fells to visit a dying boy he'd never met. October 6, 1926 was supposed to be Ruth's day off before Game 4 of the World Series. The Yankees were down 2-1 against the Cardinals, and Ruth's performance in the series had been disappointing by his own standards. He was facing intense pressure from fans and media who expected him to single-handedly carry his team to victory. But instead of resting or practicing, Ruth spent his afternoon making the drive from New York City to a small hospital in New Jersey. When Ruth walked into Johnny's hospital room that day, something remarkable happened. The boy, who had been barely conscious for hours, suddenly opened his eyes and smiled for the first time in days. "Johnny," Ruth said, sitting down beside the bed, "I hear you're a baseball fan." What followed was a conversation that would change both their lives forever. Ruth didn't treat Johnny like a dying child. He talked to him like a fellow baseball lover, discussing strategy and players and what it felt like to step into the batter's box with 60,000 people watching. Johnny, despite his weakness, perked up in ways that amazed the nurses and doctors. But then Ruth did something that no one expected. "Johnny," he said, "I want to make you a promise. Tomorrow, when I play in Game 4, I'm going to hit a home run just for you. And when I round those bases, I want you to think about getting better, because I want you to come see me play in person someday." Johnny's eyes widened. Even in his weakened state, he understood the magnitude of what Ruth was promising. This wasn't just any game. This was the World Series. The pressure was immense. Ruth was struggling at the plate. And now he was promising to deliver when it mattered most, not for his team or his fans, but for one dying boy. Ruth spent nearly an hour at Johnny's bedside, signing baseballs and sharing stories that made the boy laugh despite his pain. When he finally left, he made sure Johnny understood that he meant every word of his promise. "I'll be listening on the radio," Johnny whispered. "Then you better get ready to celebrate," Ruth replied. What Ruth didn't tell anyone was how deeply the visit had affected him. His teammates later said they'd never seen him so emotional. This was a man who thrived under pressure on the baseball field, but the sight of that dying boy had shaken him to his core. Ruth had grown up in difficult circumstances himself, essentially abandoned by his family and raised in a reform school. He knew what it felt like to be alone and scared. Maybe that's why Johnny's situation touched him so deeply. Game 4 of the 1926 World Series was played at Sportsman's Park in St. Louis on October 7th. Ruth knew that back in New Jersey, a dying boy would be listening to every pitch on the radio. The pressure was enormous. The Yankees needed to win to stay alive in the series. Ruth's personal struggles at the plate had become a major story, and now he had made a promise to a child that he desperately wanted to keep. When Ruth came to bat in the first inning, something was different. His teammates noticed it immediately. There was a focus and determination in his eyes that they hadn't seen all series. The first pitch was a ball. The second was a strike. The count went to 2-1, and then Cardinals pitcher Flint Rem delivered what he thought was a perfect fastball on the outside corner. Ruth connected with a swing that sent the ball soaring high and deep toward the right field stands. The crowd of 38,000 Cardinals fans watched in stunned silence as the ball cleared the fence by at least 20 feet. As Ruth rounded the bases, he looked up toward the sky as if sending a message to a boy 900 miles away. But Ruth wasn't finished. In the fourth inning, facing reliever High Bell, Ruth came to the plate again. This time, the Cardinals were ready for him. They pitched carefully, trying to avoid giving him anything good to hit, but Ruth was patient. He worked the count to 3-2, then connected with another pitch that sailed over the right field wall. 2 home runs in one game, and both of them hit with the pressure of a dying boy's hope weighing on his shoulders. Back in New Jersey, Johnny Sylvester was listening to every moment on the radio. According to nurses who were there, the boy's condition seemed to improve with each home run. His fever was breaking, and he was sitting up in bed for the first time in days. But Ruth still wasn't done. In the seventh inning, with the Yankees leading 8-1, Ruth came to bat for what would be his final time in the game. By now, even the hostile Cardinals fans were anticipating something special. They had witnessed 2 majestic home runs, and they sensed that history might be in the making. Ruth worked the count to 2-1, then swung at a pitch that seemed to hang in the air forever before landing in the center field bleachers. 3 home runs in one World Series game, a feat that had never been accomplished before. As Ruth circled the bases for the third time, something extraordinary happened. The Cardinals fans, who had been booing him mercilessly for 3 games, rose to their feet and applauded. They understood they were witnessing something that transcended team loyalties. Ruth later said that as he rounded third base after that final home run, he wasn't thinking about baseball records or World Series victories. He was thinking about an 11-year-old boy in a hospital bed who needed to believe that miracles were possible. The Yankees won Game 4 by a score of 10-5, but the real victory was happening 900 miles away in New Jersey. Johnny Sylvester's recovery began that very night. His fever broke completely, and by the next morning he was asking for solid food for the first time in a week. Doctors who had been preparing his family for the worst were suddenly cautiously optimistic. Was it coincidence? Medical professionals in 1926 didn't fully understand the connection between hope and healing, but Johnny's doctors couldn't deny what they were seeing. The boy's condition had begun improving at exactly the time Ruth was delivering on his promise. Ruth called the hospital the next day to check on Johnny's condition. When he heard the good news, teammates said the tough New York slugger broke down and cried. "I've hit a lot of home runs," Ruth told a reporter later, "but I never hit any that meant more to me than those 3. The story of Johnny Sylvester became national news. Newspapers across the country picked up the tale of the dying boy and the baseball hero who saved his life. But what made the story even more remarkable was what happened next. Ruth didn't forget about Johnny once the cameras moved on. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a one-time gesture. Ruth and Johnny began a friendship that would last for years. As Johnny recovered his strength, Ruth invited him to games at Yankee Stadium. The boy who had been dying became Ruth's guest in the Yankees dugout, learning about baseball from the greatest player of his generation. Ruth sent Johnny equipment, including bats and gloves. He made sure the boy had tickets to important games. Most importantly, he continued to treat Johnny not as a symbol or a story, but as a genuine friend. Johnny went on to make a complete recovery. He grew up to become a successful businessman and lived a full life, eventually reaching the age of 74. But he never forgot the day Babe Ruth saved his life. In interviews later in his life, Johnny would always insist that Ruth's promise and subsequent home runs were directly responsible for his recovery. "Before that day, I had given up," he would say. "After Babe hit those home runs for me, I knew I was going to live." Modern medical science understands much more about the connection between psychological state and physical healing. Studies have shown that hope, purpose, and positive emotional experiences can have measurable effects on immune function and recovery rates. In 1926, doctors didn't have the research to explain why Johnny Sylvester began recovering precisely when Babe Ruth delivered on his promise. They just knew that something remarkable had happened. But the Johnny Sylvester story revealed something equally important about Babe Ruth himself. This was a man who understood that his fame came with responsibilities that extended far beyond the baseball field. Ruth could have sent a telegram. He could have had someone else visit Johnny. He could have made a vague promise about trying his best. Instead, he put his reputation on the line with a specific measurable commitment that he delivered on under the most intense pressure imaginable. This wasn't the only time Ruth went out of his way for sick children. Throughout his career, he made hundreds of hospital visits that never made the newspapers. He understood instinctively that his presence could provide hope to people who had little left to hold on to.
Ruth's generosity with children wasn't always well publicized because he specifically asked that many of his hospital visits not be reported. He didn't want families to feel like they were being used for publicity. He genuinely cared about the children he met, and he understood that sometimes the most meaningful help comes without fanfare.
The Johnny Sylvester story also highlighted something else about Ruth's character, his ability to perform under pressure that had nothing to do with winning games. Athletes talk about pressure all the time. The pressure of big games, playoff situations, contract negotiations. But Ruth faced a different kind of pressure that day in St. Louis. He had promised a dying child that he would hit a home run. The boy's life might literally depend on believing that miracles were possible. That's pressure that goes beyond anything that happens in sports. It's pressure that cuts to the very core of what it means to be human. And Ruth didn't just deliver once. He delivered 3 times in the same game, creating one of the most extraordinary individual performances in World Series history, while carrying the weight of a dying boy's hope. Years later, sports psychologists would study Ruth's performance in Game 4 of the 1926 World Series as an example of how external motivation, specifically the desire to help someone else, can elevate athletic performance beyond normal levels. But for Johnny Sylvester and his family, there was nothing academic about what happened that day. Ruth had quite literally given them back their son. The friendship between Ruth and Johnny continued even after Ruth's playing career ended. When Ruth was diagnosed with cancer in 1946, Johnny was among the visitors who came to see his childhood hero. The roles had reversed. Now it was Johnny trying to provide hope and encouragement to Ruth. "You saved my life once," Johnny told Ruth during one of those hospital visits. "Now I want you to fight the way you taught me to fight." Ruth died in 1948, but Johnny lived on for another 42 years. He named his son after Babe Ruth. He attended Yankees games well into his 70s, always remembering the day when his hero proved that some promises are worth more than any championship. The story of Johnny Sylvester and Babe Ruth became one of baseball's most beloved legends, but it was also something more important, proof that sports heroes can have an impact that transcends athletics. In an era when we sometimes wonder about the role of athletes in society, the story of Johnny Sylvester reminds us that sports figures have always had the power to inspire hope, create connections, and literally save lives. Ruth understood this responsibility instinctively. He knew that being the best baseball player in the world meant more than just hitting home runs and winning games. It meant using his platform to touch lives in ways that would matter long after the final scores were forgotten. Today, when we hear about athletes visiting children's hospitals or starting charitable foundations, we're seeing the legacy of what Babe Ruth began. He established the template for how sports heroes can use their fame as a force for good. But the Johnny Sylvester story also reminds us that sometimes the most important victories happen one person at a time, one promise at a time, one act of kindness at a time. On October 7, 1926, Babe Ruth didn't just hit 3 home runs in a World Series game. He saved a boy's life, created a lifelong friendship, and demonstrated that true greatness isn't just about what you accomplish for yourself, it's about what you're willing to do for others. Every time Johnny Sylvester told his story in the decades that followed, he would end it the same way. "Babe Ruth taught me that promises matter, and that when someone believes in you, you can do things you never thought possible." That might be the greatest lesson any sports hero ever taught, that belief, hope, and love can create miracles that no statistic can measure.